There's just something about the monochrome style of the original Game Boy with these two, what they call wine red buttons, that just looks absolutely timeless. I love it. So much so that I've built a modern tribute with an IPS screen, as well as a Game Boy Pocket with a screen upgrade, and even a Game Boy Color in the same style. I just love it. And now we can say hello to the new addition to the family, the DMG SP. It's nice. The shell is a fairly new release from eXtremeRate. I've built stuff of theirs before and it's been pretty good, so when I saw this in the Black Friday sale, I had to grab one. The screen that I used on this build is the HISPEEDIDO drop-in kit. You simply just open up the console, take out the old screen and drop the new one in, and that is it. It's a fantastic little kit, and there's also the option to solder in a wire to do further upgrades as well. But in terms of this video, I wanted to do it as the easiest possible build to upgrade your SP. Didn't necessarily work out like that, as with most things I do. I encountered a few problems along the way, but it is an awesome way for a newcomer to the hobby to be able to build something. Anyway, let's just get onto the build itself. So of course, as well as the shell and the other bits, you're gonna need a console as a donor. Now, before you get your knickers in a twist, this is not an original Nintendo NES style Game Boy Advance SP. It's just your average bog standard AGS 001 that I had put a repro shell on a while ago. So don't panic, no rare consoles harmed in the making of this video. So to get the console open, you're going to need two different screwdrivers, a crosshead and a tri-wing. I got one of each with the eXtremeRate kit, but like eXtremeRate kits I've had before, the parts are fantastic, the tools are abysmal. So I did persevere with them, but I ended up going back to my main tools at some point in the job. So if you are going to be doing something like this yourself, I'd recommend having some decent tools to do the job. The ones that come with the kits, you can get by, but you'll get frustrated. So it is worth upgrading for your own stuff. And that'll motivate you to get onto more modding projects in future, which is no bad thing. Anyway, so to get to the motherboard is pretty easy. Flip the console over, use your crosshead screwdriver to get your battery out, and then you've got 6 tri-wing screws exposed. Undo all of those and you'll be able to get the back off. It just simply slides off. Then you can see the motherboard, which is held in place with 3 crosshead screws. You just undo those 3 and you'll be able to lift out the motherboard. That is still attached with the ribbon to the screen, and you just undo the clips at either end and the ribbon will slide out, and now you've got your motherboard. And pretty much you could get away with just that motherboard. That's the only original part that you really need. So in addition to the motherboard itself, there's a few other parts you might want to harvest from the console. You'll need a battery, you can take that out. If you are doing an IPS upgrade, I'd recommend upgrading your battery. I use the Helder 800 milliamp hour one, and it's great. I've used that in other consoles before. In addition to the battery, you'll need a speaker that just lifts out from the console dead easy. So the last part, and the sticking point inevitably when it comes to modding the SP compared to the DMG, the Pocket, the Color, everything else, is these hinges. They can be a nuisance to take out and put away, and it puts a lot of people off modding this excellent console. Once you get the hang of working with these hinges, it's not actually that bad, so don't let it put you off. I'll explain it as we go further along. If you can though, I would recommend buying some hinges instead of trying to salvage them from the console. It will save you a bit of a headache. Okay, so in the past, when I've bought shell kits for the Game Boy Advance SP, they actually come largely assembled. The shoulder buttons are normally in place along with the ground shield and things, and you basically just drop your motherboard and your screen in and away you go. With this one, everything was separate because there were spares, there were choices of different color buttons. It was really nice. You could kind of build your own bespoke version of that particular shell. So if you've bought the same kit as someone else, you might not have the same end build. I liked having that choice and getting to pick and choose which colors I used for which bits to try and match the DMG aesthetic. The biggest change I went for was using the red colored shoulder buttons so that when it's closed, it still had that DMG aesthetic, and it ended up looking really good with that. The thing that bothered me a little bit was that the gray and the black looked pretty much the same. There wasn't much difference between those. I would have liked the gray buttons to have been a bit lighter, so it was a more obvious contrast between the two, but it's a minor gripe, and when it's all put together, it really does look the part. So before we move on to the motherboard, prepping the rear shell, you've just got a few jobs to do with that. First of all, there's a small square nut which is essential for holding the battery cover in place, and is one of those things that you'll tend to forget while you're doing everything else. You put the whole console together and you realize you can't get the battery cover on, so definitely get that done first. It's just a little square nut. Line it up with some tweezers in position and push it in place, and it'll stay secured in position. Then you've got your shoulder button. So for each shoulder button, you've got the button itself, you've got a spring, and you've got a pin. There's like an angled bit on the spring that sits against the button itself. The circular part of the spring, the springy bit the coil, that's it. I forgot what it's called. The coil of the spring will line up with the hole in the shoulder button, and then you feed the pin through and just drop it in place in the shell. Then if you use a spudger or tweezers to pull the spring around and hook it into the little bits on the shell, once they're secured in place, they're pretty much held in place. They're not going to be falling out or going anywhere. So you can pop those two in place and give them a little wiggle to test they're moving okay, and you'll be fine. Lastly, you've got the ground shield. It comes with a sticker that goes over the top on the inside. You'll see how I've put that in place there to match the original one. One thing that I did miss though is on the other side there's like a protective layer of polythene, like blue polythene, and I forgot to take that off. Later on when I was reassembling it all, I noticed that and I had to remove the shield and peel it off. So make sure you peel it off before you put it in place, but if you forget, it's not a great disaster. So that is it for the back shell. We've got the shoulder buttons, we've got the ground shield, and we've got the battery cover nut in place. Now for the dreaded hinges. So before the hinges go into the console, there's little plastic caps. There's a little section on the end of the hinge and the cap just slides in place and then it pushes into the console, and those caps are never going to come off. Now with the cheap spare hinges I'd found, there's like a bit of a rivet sticking out at the end, so you can't really slide those across. I had a check on ZedLabz website. They sell some really good ones with the flat edges just like the originals. So if you want to save yourself the headache of trying to remove the old hinges, you can just buy a pair of those. They're pretty cheap anyway. But if you're buying things, you have to be patient and you have to wait for them to arrive, and I am not patient waiting for things to arrive. So I decided to take out the hinges from my previous build, and doing that isn't actually too difficult so long as you know what you're doing. So I 3D printed one of the removal tools that I've designed. It makes the job quite a bit easier. So to get to the hinges, what you've got to do is lift up the ribbon and you'll spot a cross head screw underneath it. Undo that, a cap comes off the top, and you'll be able to see inside at the end to one of the hinges. So you can use a screwdriver to try and poke it out or something like that, but if you're using my tool, you simply hook it around the little plastic clips, give it a firm push, and it'll just pop out, and then you can pull that out of the end. Now to get to the other one, you technically need to disassemble the whole screen assembly on top, but if you're not going to be really doing that, like I wasn't going to be taking the screen out or anything like that because I had a new screen, what you can do is very, very carefully tilt it to one side and then slide it out, and then the whole screen assembly will come away and you'll be able to see the other hinge at the other side. Now you may need to use the tool or it might just pop straight out, but that one should come out fairly easily. After that, you need to slide off the end caps, put your new ones on, and you're ready to assemble. So whenever I am doing a Game Boy Advance SP build, before I touch the motherboard, before I bother with the screen, before I do anything else, getting that control panel and the aperture for the screen together with the hinge is important. Once you've got that done, it is plain sailing. So it's worth taking the time to get that right. Now, the key to doing this is that inside the holes, there are little nubs on the inside. And what you have to do is get those lined up. Basically, when it's at the closed position or the open position, it kind of locks in place. And it's when it's at that open position, which is when you need to put these little barrels in. So if you lay the parts down on their side and you take a little careful look inside, you'll see those little nubs. Just rotate the parts until they align. Take the hinge part. The hinge barrel has like two little slots. Obviously, they need to line up with the little nubs. Push it in gently and then give a firm push with your thumb. It'll just click straight in place. Then that's dead easy because it's held in position. You flip it over, you get the other hinge barrel, line it up with the nubs, push it in, click, and you've got that part done. After that, you're pretty much just assembling things together like a Lego kit, so it gets much easier from there. And you can feel all proud of yourself because you did those hinges that everybody else hates doing. Now, what I wanted to do with this video is show you just how easy it is to build something awesome, even if you're relatively new to the hobby or you've got limited resources in terms of tools and equipment. So you don't even need to do any soldering with this kit that I've got. You don't need to do any cutting on the shell. The screen simply drops in, connects to the motherboard, and it works. And that's what I decided to do with this build. Now you can get them with the screen lens in various different colors. I bought a white one and a black one because I wasn't sure which one to use in this case. I decided to go with the black. Now the thing is, this particular shell kit comes with a screen overlay that not only protects your screen, but also has an authentic looking gray border. So really the color of the background didn't matter too much. So I didn't want that to show up too much from the back, which is why I went with the black. And in hindsight, that has been a good choice. So I got the new screen laid it into the shell just to check everything would fit in place, and it fitted fine. So I lifted it back out, peeled off the protective film, and pushed it in place. Now the ribbon has to roll around on itself a certain way, so I checked with an old screen to make sure I was wrapping it the right way. You basically roll it up and over itself and then feed it through the hole, and then you can put that cap over the top again. Secure that with a longer crosshead screw from the back. Speaking of screws, the kit came with a whole set of screws. It was color coded. There were short and long ones in both crosshead and tri-wing, and they just matched up to the one that I'd taken apart previously. So I used new screws for the whole of this build just to see how the quality was, and the screws themselves were actually pretty good. So with the screen dropped in place, it does need to be held securely. There's a little blue plastic backing on it that needs peeling off to reveal a self-adhesive section on the back of the glass lens. And then if you put the other half of the shell in place and push it down, it secures everything in position and stops the screen from sliding around in the shell. Then if you look from the screen side, there are 5 holes that need to have screws put in place. They need to be the short screws. You don't want anything popping through the shell and ruining the look of your whole project. So find 5 short tri-wing screws from the kit that you got with the shell and put each one of those in place. You also get little self-adhesive rubber bits that will drop into the holes and cover up the screws. You put the flat ones in the 2 at the bottom and the one in the middle at the top, and the raised bumpy ones go in the top left and right corner. They set off the aesthetic nicely and they match the color of the shell really well. Now the top was an odd one. I didn't realize that it didn't actually have a little jewel. Normally on the shell you get like a little recess and the jewel sticker sits in place. With this, the DMG 01 logo is just screen printed on a flat surface and it looks really nice. Now the surface of this shell is quite sort of it's that sort of soft touch rubbery kind of feel to it, and I just got the figure that it might be prone to scratches. So I got some of the packaging that it originally came with, laid it out flat so that when I had the console flipped over and was actually resting on that top surface, it was sitting on that soft protective surface and wasn't going to scratch anything up. So as you are going through these processes, before you even use the console, a lot of the time you are prone to scratching and damage it while you're moving it around on a work surface. So it is worth thinking ahead and just protecting any parts you can while you're going through that build, and that's what I did there. Now at this point I just basically gave up on the eXtremeRate tools. The quality was poor, they were stripping at the end, they were making it frustrating, and there was no point when I've got loads of tools at my disposal. So I swapped over to another pair, which are actually another cheap low-cost pair that came free with another kit for something else I was doing. So it's not like they have to provide really high quality tools, just like usable ones. It just feels like a bit of a letdown when you buy in essentially what is a premium kit. These shells are more expensive than a lot of the cheaper other kits that you can buy on the market. So if they're providing the tools, it's not too much to ask that they're going to be decent quality. But if it's just the tools and the kit that we end up with is good, then I'd take that trade-off. I'd rather have that than good tools and poor quality shells. So anyway, rant over. Where were we? So with the screen section all in place, you can close the hinge, flip the console over and start to build the inside. So before you put the motherboard in, you need to get all the buttons in place. You need to drop the speaker in. Make sure you put the little dust cover in. The kit came with a dust cover as well, because a lot of the time that's one of the bits that I lose. So you can drop the dust cover in, put the speaker in. You don't need to do any soldering with the speaker. It's just a direct metal contact on that, so nothing to worry about there. Now you've got that ribbon to get sorted first, and the ribbon is on the button side. So that is quite fiddly. So what I find is if you've got the motherboard kind of vertical, so if you've got like the shell sitting flat upside down, you hold the motherboard vertical and you gently lift up the ribbon. You can slide it into the slot and then very carefully try and reach those 2 clamps to just clip it in place. Once it's secured in place, you can move the motherboard around freely and it shouldn't drop out, so that makes things easier. Finally, you've got the little clear plastic bit which directs the light from the LEDs. That just sits into the 2 holes in the top left. When they're all in position, it's time to lower the motherboard down. Just carefully lower it, make sure it aligns itself correctly, make sure it's not raised up because you might have knocked the buttons or something like that. And then you've got the 3 short crosshead screws to secure that in position. With the motherboard secured, it's time to put it back together. Don't forget about the cap for the power switch. That just slots in place. Then you take the entire rear assembly, carefully lower it down. If it won't quite line up, give a little wiggle on the shoulder buttons. It's usually those that are stopping it from clicking together. And before you screw it together, just have a quick inspection around the sides to make sure everything is in place. When you're putting the screws in, you need 2 short tri-wing screws in the middle at the top and the bottom, and 4 longer ones, 1 for each corner. When they're all screwed in, it's time to pop in your battery and find your battery cover. Now, the original battery covers have got a screw that goes through, and there's like a little C-clip to stop it dropping out. There was no C-clip with this kit. It did come with 2 battery cover screws, so there's a spare one in case you lose it, but I don't really like the idea of having to keep a close eye on that screw whenever I'm swapping the battery. I'd rather it was part of the integral piece. So I'm probably going to try and harvest the C-clip from one of my older covers and attach it onto this one at some point. But it does the job. You put the battery cover in place, put the screw in, and everything is secured. It's time to test it. Now, when I did it with my Helder battery, I got no power. I thought, oh, what have I done? What have I done wrong? What have I not connected? But then I got my multimeter, checked on the battery, and that ships, it seems, with 0 power in it whatsoever, which is fine as long as it will recharge, because sometimes a dead battery is very difficult to recharge. So I tried plugging in my charger, and thankfully the orange light came on and stayed on. So I knew that would be fine. And when I was doing some initial testing, I just popped that out for the time being, put my old battery in, and that was fine to switch on and see that everything was working. The little touch controls where you just tap on the lower border around the screen, you can keep tapping and it gradually increases the brightness and then resets back down to 0 and then keeps going back up. And you can also press a little further along and that will change the color palette if you need to do that. I mean, the thing is, the Game Boy Advance is in color anyway, so those color tints aren't particularly useful, but the monochrome is pretty good if you're doing Game Boy games and you want those to look authentic. So there are the options for that, and it's relatively easy to control, and you don't have any additional switches or additional wiring or anything like that to get that working, which I think is great. I know not everybody loves those touch controls, but it is a nice, quick, easy way of doing these things without having to do any soldering at all. So with everything together and tested, the final part was to just put that cover over the screen, which I thought was going to be something easy, but actually ended up being the biggest headache of the whole thing. And you can watch how I go ahead with it and see if that's for you and decide maybe you might just not bother and it'd be fine just leaving it with the original black lens. It'll look fine and it'll save you a lot of hassle. Anyway, what happened was I was very, very careful to peel the back off that and make sure there was no dust, nothing. Everything was completely clean surfaces. Carefully laid it in position, got the positioning good. As I was just pressing around the edges, sticking it in place, I noticed right in the middle there was like a big splodge. Now this is what's called Newton's rings, I think. It's something that used to happen a lot when you were doing the old LED backlights on the Game Boys before you got the IPS screens, and you would have to have a polarizing filter over the top of your screen, and when the two very smooth surfaces were touching together, you'd get this kind of pressure mark, this splodge. And all I wanted to do was try and separate those two surfaces, because all that happens is what you can see is the two surfaces touching, but it's really distracting. It looked awful. It looks like you've got water in there, even though it's not wet at all. And I tried a few things. I got like one of those little suckers that you can use to try and remove things and just put it in the middle of the screen. I tried to lift a little bit and then peel off to see if that would separate the two layers, but no luck. So my next option was to remove the lens cover itself and try and give everything a clean and carefully put it back in position. But it was really hard. It goes all the way up to the edges, so you can't really get under anything. I was definitely not going to put anything sharp like a knife under there. I tried using a spudger, didn't quite manage to lift it. Tried putting a sucker at the corners, but it stuck down really securely. And if anything, it was starting to show a little bit of distress in the display itself from where I'd been pulling on it. I didn't want to damage anything. So I used a spudger to just pop out the little rubber caps on those 5 screws on the screen assembly, and then used a tri-wing screwdriver to get those out and carefully removed the back. And that allowed me to push the screen assembly out. And then from there, I could get underneath the cover and carefully peel it off. There was a tiny little speck of dust that I thought might have been the problem, so I got that off, cleaned the surfaces, put it back together again. Same thing happened. Still getting those Newton rings, still getting those little splodges that I wanted to get rid of. So disassembled it again, peeled it off again, and I remembered an old trick that I used to use when I was doing the old DMG builds, which is the problem is you've got two extremely clean, smooth surfaces touching together, and when they are together, they try to connect and they can't completely do that, so the two surfaces just sort of contact one another and make that kind of splodge. What you actually need, and it goes against all your kind of OCD logic, you actually need some dust in between. You need something to separate them. So what I used to do is use what's called talc-free talc. It's like very, very fine powder, and you just kind of puff some of that on the screen and then get a fan brush and just brush it all off. You basically sprinkle it on the screen, brush it around, and then brush it off. So to the naked eye, it looks like there's none on there, but there'll be a very, very fine layer of dust. And then you put that back on. Trust me, honestly, it doesn't look bad at all. You can't even see it. But you put that back on, and hopefully it'll keep the two surfaces separate enough that they don't keep trying to just merge together. So I did that, and it kind of worked, but there was still a little bit of a dot in the middle. So I disassembled it all again, peeled it off again, put some more of the powder on, brushed it off a little more carefully this time, making sure that there was some coverage all over the screen before I'd removed it. Then I put it back together again, and that time it worked. So there's a tip for you. If you do that and you're getting those surfaces touching, the one I've used is called MediPure Body Powder. I'm sure there's other ones you can get, but that one definitely does work. And I have used it loads of times in the past on DMG builds, so it is pretty proven for me. So I knew it was a fairly safe bet to put on this console. But as I say, this was meant to be, here's the easiest Game Boy build that you can do. It's just put it all together, plug and play. That is not easy. So the easy option to that is just ditch that lens cover if you don't want to go through all that hassle. But if you do that and you are getting the issue with the bits touching, now you know how to fix it. So with that all back together, it was looking pretty good. So I needed to address the issue with the new battery, and it was getting pretty late on by that point. So I swapped out the original battery, put the Helder one in, and put it on charge overnight. When I came back to it the next day, I unplugged it and everything was working fine. So hopefully I'll get plenty of life out of that battery now that it is all charged. I gave it a good test and I was liking it. It looked good. The touch controls were quite easy. It was playing the games really well. It felt nice. That sort of soft touch rubber felt really nice to play with. So while I was testing it, I noticed a small red wire to the side, which is what comes with the screen kit. So although you've got these touch controls enabled, there is still the original brightness button on the front of the shell, which isn't currently doing anything. And what you can do is you can wire up a single wire inside the console that then gives that a new functionality. And I figured if you want an easy build, you might just drop that screen in and it works fine. But if you want a little bit more of a challenge, or if you want a bit more functionality and you have yourself a soldering iron, I would definitely recommend you give this a go. So I figured I'd show you that anyway. I opened up the back again, you know how to do that from earlier, and I got to a point where I lifted out the motherboard and just kind of, it worked best if I flipped out the motherboard and supported the rest of the assembly sort of vertically. I actually used the box that came with the shell kit to do that, so that's just stood up. So you've got one wire to attach to two contact points. One is on the new ribbon. There's two little gold dots. You can solder to either one of those. And on the motherboard, just near the top right of the D-pad area, you're looking for a little gold contact point marked Q12B. So the easiest way to do this, if you've got some flux, put it on the two contact points first, but if you haven't, don't worry about it, it'll still work, especially because most solder's got a bit of flux built into the core anyway. So you heat up the little point, melt a bit of solder onto it, and do that the same on both of those. Then get your wire, line it up with the blob you just added to the contact points, reheat, hold the wire in position, and it should secure it pretty well. I did the ribbon first with the wire coming in from the right, and then looped the wire around so I could get to the Q12B point, held that in position, reheated. After that, the wire can get in the way of your buttons and things, so I routed that a little more carefully so it wasn't going to touch the speaker, it wasn't going to touch the rubber membranes, and used a little bit of Kapton tape just to secure it in place. After that, you reassemble as you did before, switch on, and give it a test. And now you've got a bit more functionality to that little button in the middle. If you just gradually tap it, it will go through the brightness cycle, which is a lot easier than fumbling about at the top with the touch controls and trying to work out exactly where they are. Also, if you press and hold the button, it brings up an on-screen display, and you can cycle through various different settings and have a bit more precise control over what you're doing, which I find quite satisfying, and it is something a little extra. So it functions quite well without it, but if you go to the trouble of soldering it, you get that little reward with a bit more functionality. So if you have access to a soldering iron and you're a bit nervous about it, I'd say just go for it. It's not as hard as you might think, and in fact, I love soldering. It's great fun, and I always try and persuade people to do it if they want to have a go at it, and you get extra functionality out of it. So give it a go. And if you don't want to do it or you don't have the kit, it's nice to know that you can buy this screen and it'll work just fine. So as I said before, the end result of this is fantastic. It is a gorgeous looking shell. It's very, very good quality. The print is really crisp and clear, and it does have that Game Boy aesthetic, albeit with a slightly different tone of grey. It looks really nice, but it is sufficiently different to the original to give it a fresh new look. So I have bought myself another one of these eXtremeRate kits with a Super Nintendo style to it. I'll be doing that build in a few weeks with an AGS 101 console. That should be quite good fun. So it is really awesome that you can now do builds like this without having to do any soldering, without having to do any cutting of the console, just a simple, straightforward swap of the parts. But there is still the sticking point of that hinge, and unless you know what you're doing, that can be frustrating. Thankfully, I am here to the rescue. I have designed a tool that will help you with removing the hinges if you are trying it out for yourself. And if you want to know a little bit more about that tool and how to use it, you will definitely want to go and check out the video I've got up here. Go on, click on it. It's good, it's clever, it works well, it'll save you a lot of hassle. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.